Eugene Planning Commission meeting for June 14th, 2022. I want to thank you all for joining us in the remote meeting format that we're continuing to use. Our meeting today will begin with an opportunity for public comment, and that'll be followed by a work session on the proposed amendments to the land use code to the Willamette Greenway. There's a couple of things I want to do as we get started. I want to note that anybody who wants to access this meeting can do so by watching live stream available on our website or the broadcast on Comcast channel 21, or you can follow the access instructions listed on the meeting agenda. And if you do join us remotely, note that your microphone, webcam, and phone are automatically muted when you enter the meeting as an attendee. Also, if you are joining us and you wish to participate during the public comment portion of the meeting, which is coming up, if you haven't already done so, please raise your virtual hand now and you can join the speakers queue. That'll happen in one of two ways. If you're viewing the meeting on a computer, laptop, or another device, you can click once on the blue hand icon. And if you're listening to the meeting on a phone, you can press *9. So before I move on to public comment, I want to take a couple of minutes and I want to welcome our new commissioner, Diane Bailing. I want to let you know, Diane, how happy we are to have you here and have you joining the Planning Commission. What I'd like to do is give you a chance to introduce yourself, and then I want to go around briefly and have each of the other commissioners introduce themselves. So, Diane.
All right. Well, I moved here 3 years ago last month from Santa Cruz, California, where I worked for 15 years at the university in capital planning and participated in doing several large area plans, budgeting, and documentation of capital projects for submission to the state. Just after we moved here, the whole world shut down. So during the pandemic, I didn't do much of anything except possibly start my garden. I am a LEED accredited professional, and sustainability is very near and dear to my heart. Environmentally, this is, of course, a beautiful place to be. And I'm delighted to be working with you all and looking forward to getting to know you a little better.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and welcome. I'll just go next. I'm Ken Beeson. I've been on the Planning Commission for 3 years, and I've pretty much lived in Eugene my whole life. Went to school here, worked at Eugene Water and Electric Board, retired from there back in 2010. Done a few other things since then. I've been on the Budget Committee and Human Services Commission, couple of other civic things, but I've been involved with the Planning Commission now, and I'm doing a lot of continuing learning about planning here in Eugene, and I appreciate working with this group and certainly with working with the staff. So that's me. Anybody else can just jump in.
I'll go. My name is Dan Isaacson. I'm the Vice Chair of the Planning Commission, and welcome. We're glad to have you. I'm a small business owner. I also serve as the president of the National Alliance of Mental Illness here in town in Verlaine County, and the co-chair of the Suicide Prevention Coalition. So a lot of my volunteer time is in the mental health field, trying to kind of tilt at that windmill, as you would say. But we're really glad to have you.
Welcome, Diane. Lisa Fragola, and it's good to see you again. I live in the Friendly area neighborhood and have been in Eugene since the early 90s when not traveling somewhere else. And I'm excited for you to join us.
Hello, Diane. My name is Chris Ramey. I'm a lifetime Eugenian, born, raised, and educated here in Eugene. Worked in the East Coast for a while. I'm trained as an architect, registered in 2 states, but spent most of my time in the field that you spent most of your time in. I was University of Oregon's architect, so higher education, facilities planning and management. And I'm guessing that you know my good friend, Frank Zwart, or at least you know his name. He was my colleague at Santa Cruz and responsible for mentoring me and did a lot to bring me along in my career.
We worked together for many, many years.
Frank's an A+ guy. He's a good guy. Then I do sort of following in Chairman Beeson's footsteps here. This is my civic involvement currently. I also work with the Community Development Block Grant Advisory Committee. And I am the liaison from this committee to, well, I'm sorry, I guess unofficially, to the Sustainability Commission.
Ah.
So I attend their meetings and report back on important things that happen. So it's wonderful to have you here. I think you'll find this is a really good group to work with, and we're glad you could join us.
Thank you.
I think that's it. Commissioner Edwards is absent tonight. She'll meet her next time, or maybe you've already met her, but we have one other commissioner. We had a new commissioner appointed last night, not knowing they're sitting here with their name, and Alyssa will fill us in on that, but we're going to have a full complement of commissioners here, I think, by early July, I'm guessing. So anyway, welcome. We're glad to have you. Okay, so let's see here. I want to move to public comment. Trying to find my screen here to see if I guess I'm going to ask Jeff or others. Do we have any of the public who's indicated they want to speak to us?
Yes, we have one hand raised at this time.
Okay.
I'm going to, with your permission, Commissioner Beeson, I'll add him as a panelist and allow him to join us.
Yeah, so okay. I'll just welcome the person that's going to speak. I want to let you know we've got about 3 minutes for you to speak. We do public comment at the start of most of our meetings, and appreciate you being here. And I'll just let you go. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Beeson, and thanks to all the members of the Planning Commission, especially your new member, Diane Bailey. My name is Jonathan Belcher. John, please. I am a retired planning commissioner from longer than all of you have served, but am also the co-chair of the River Road Community Organization. And I hope that you managed to receive a letter that our neighborhood association sent to you probably yesterday, requesting some changes to the Willamette Greenway ordinance as you review it for your clear and objective standards. I can tell you as a neighborhood leader, the Willamette Greenway ordinance has been very frustrating to us for the very reason you're reviewing it. The fact that it is the most unclear and objective ordinance I've seen in my work with land use planning makes it such that when the required hearings that the hearings officials have to have over the issues, to the maximum extent practical that most of the criteria are required to meet is an impossible requirement. And therefore the hearings officials, in my experience in reviewing and being involved with previous decisions in my neighborhood, almost nothing had ever been required of a developer unless they volunteered to do so. So for that reason, the ordinance clearly needs to be revised, and I'm glad you're doing it. We submitted to you, I think, a total of either 12 or 13 suggestions that we at 13 as a neighborhood association, we would like you to consider as you review changing that ordinance, and we will be happy to participate in explaining or discussing any of those or all those as you deem appropriate. So with that, I will stop talking and hope that we will be engaging on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Do we have anyone else?
Well, we do not have any other hands raised.
Okay, all right. Thank you, John. So I guess at this point, we're going to move on. I want to move on to agenda item B, which is the work session on the Willamette Greenway Code amendments. And I'm going to turn it over to Principal Planner Gabe Flock. And he's going to lead us through this.
Thank you, Chair Beeson, and good evening, Commissioners. I'm going to point out that Commissioner Fragla, before we start, that Commissioner Fragla has her hand up, and I believe Jeff may have something to say. So let's address that before we dive in.
Who should go first, Chair Beeson?
I was actually just raising my hand for you, Commissioner Fragla.
Thank you. Such a
Commissioner Fragala.
I just wanted to say, I don't believe I have received an email from the River Road Santa Clara Neighborhood Association. And I'm just wondering if anyone else did receive it, or maybe staff got it. And I'm just curious.
I can speak to that. So it was an email that came through, and it was addressed to the mayor and council, to the Eugene Planning Commission inbox, and the planning staff. And we partly are concerned about introducing that letter without having reopened the record. And so there was a little hesitation based on my judgment, frankly. I believe that there's a lot of valuable content, and Mr. Belcher's commentary on that point, I think, is timely with respect to the topic tonight. And I just want to offer that we will have additional opportunity to address that. I will make sure to send that out following the hearing tonight, so you can consider it. It does address a number of topics that are the focus of tonight's discussion, and some of the kind of topic areas and policy choices we need to or are seeking input for tonight. So
Great.
That is forthcoming, and we will make sure you have it. And it does include some very important content that I think is also maybe a good segue into the topic. So for tonight's work session, we see this as an opportunity to kind of revisit and bring back the topic. As you know, we took a pause following the public hearing in March. We had extended the record for just one additional week, but based on the testimony that we received and a high degree of public interest in more opportunity for input, and some of the topic areas that caused us to reconsider and realize the need to more closely review the proposed standards, we realized we needed to take a moment, a long moment, frankly. And so we have, in the meantime, in the throes of the middle housing code amendment process and everything else, realized a few, I think, revealing areas of potential change to the draft amendments that we wanted to surface tonight. And I realize we've provided a robust amount of information in the agenda materials, and just to sort of help frame out the flow for tonight's meeting. Yeah, Jeff, if you might share just to lead off. We would like to start with a bit of an overview, because it's been some time, and sort of reground the commission and the conversation in what it is that the Greenway project is about, what the new tools are that we propose. And, you know, I will say that the specific questions that commissioners asked following the hearing, we carefully considered and chose to group the responses and the supplemental information under somewhat general headings. And so I do want to create the space tonight, and perhaps in a somewhat informal or conversational way, to allow for commissioners to have an opportunity to revisit those in more specifics if need be. But we've sort of woven those responses and that information into the presentation tonight. And so you'll hear us talk about and touch upon some of those topics, but the flow for tonight is not necessarily organized according to those questions. So we will start with a little bit of a background, an overview. Jeff's going to assist with that. We'll talk a little bit about the proposed standards that are in the draft code currently. And honestly, during this pause, we had set out with the intent of actually making revisions and putting out a revised code, but based on the high degree of community interest in more input, I would say uncertainty about which direction we might want to go as a community. And given the substance of some of the new topics, particularly around the change in process and the topic area of tree preservation, we felt like, and this is a bit of a spoiler alert, but we are going to recommend the commission reopen the record and hold a second public hearing to afford that input. And so tonight we'd like to talk about some of those key areas. And I think perhaps at that point, at this point, we should turn it over to Jeff and do a little bit of background.
Okay, well,
but
I'm happy to take it, Gabe. So we'll dive in today on some of the key proposed changes and topics for considerations, but thank you, Gabe, for the introduction. And we're gonna first our commissioners are well versed at this point in what the Willamette Greenway is based on the previous meetings and everything else. But for those watching this evening, and as a reminder for what we're discussing, I'm gonna give a brief overview. So the Willamette Greenway, one of the biggest assets that our community has is the Willamette River running through our community. And for that matter, the Willamette River running through the state of Oregon. And so goal 15 of the statewide planning goals essentially set out to provide some protections for that. And while it looks different in some communities in terms of how they do it, all communities basically had to meet the basic tenets of goal 15, which set out some various approval criteria and other things that look at how this area will be controlled. So in Eugene, on the map to the right, you see a blue area, and that's the area I'm covering with my mouse currently. And it basically covers a large sections of town that were either publicly owned land or areas that were in consideration. And this was created as the Willamette River Greenway. And the Greenway obviously does not follow the contours of the river. It follows the contours of various property ownerships, tax lots, and the like. And so the Willamette River Greenway, I want to make this abundantly clear, was not intended to prohibit development. It was intended to make sure and ensure that development was consistent with the goals of, or with Goal 15 and the goals to maintain and enhance the Willamette River and the landscape around it. And as part of that, another thing that you'll hear me say this in any of our info sessions or previous meetings, one thing that is not changing with the proposed amendments here is the boundary of the Willamette River Greenway. So the Willamette River Greenway boundaries are staying exactly the same. And what that means is that anything within the blue area of the Willamette River Greenway, when there's an intensification of a use, requires a Willamette Greenway permit. And that's really the focus of what we're talking about is what's kind of encompassed within that Willamette Greenway permit process. And so the Willamette Greenway permit process currently is a type 3 process. It requires a public hearing. And then a type 3 process with a public hearing goes to somebody called our hearings official, who's an objective reviewer of the approval criteria. However, as we referenced briefly earlier, with some of the public comment and otherwise, the criteria are not clear and objective. And so we know that we have state law that clearly says that for needed housing, we have to have clear and objective review criteria. And the commission is abundantly familiar with our other clear and objective tracks that we've created for things like planned unit developments, conditional use permits, partitions, subdivisions, and the like. And the one application type that didn't get that treatment was the Willamette River Greenway process. And so the intent of this code amendment is to create a set of clear and objective standards that can be applied to housing that is being developed within the Willamette River Greenway. And so it's really trying to rectify that that conflict that exists, that inherent conflict between Goal 15's kind of requirements and the requirements for us to have clear and objective standards. So with that, we came to you a number of months ago with some basic kind of principles of what these code amendments were. The first piece was to establish a type 2 land use application process. So that's taking it out of the realm of a public hearing, still having a public comment period and everything else, but it would be a planning director decision as opposed to a hearings official decision. We're going to create those clear and objective approval criteria. We're going to provide a map that clearly identifies what the boundaries and setbacks are from the river, because this is another good opportunity to remind everybody that the Willamette River criteria currently, they don't have a setback from the river. The river and its riparian areas are protected through a whole set of different measures through Goal 5 and our Water Resources Conservation Overlay Zone. And so just so you know, like there is 100-foot setback from the river that comes out of our Goal 5 standards, not our Willamette Greenway standards currently. And then lastly, it was to include a design plan, which was required by Goal 15 to achieve and be able to do a type 2 process. And so that is what we brought to you a few months ago. As Gabe introduced, we do have a series of changes that are being proposed as part of this update in the process based on feedback and some things that have kind of surfaced as we've dug deeper into this process. And some of the things that we introduced at that time with the approval criteria for the clear and objective things are some standards, such as establishing a greenway setback, establishing building facade maximum lengths, controlling where parking and vehicle use areas can be located, having a native landscape buffer, walls and fences limitations, as well as pedestrian access standards. And so these were all standards that we proposed, and some of these are going to be we're going to be discussing a little bit later as well. So that's kind of the end of the overview. Now to just start off with the key proposed changes and topics for consideration. The very first one is looking at the Willamette Greenway permit procedures. And so this is the type 2 versus type 3 question here. And so just as a reminder for everybody, you see the type 3 process at the top there and the type 2 process on the bottom. They're pretty similar into the terms that you have application submission, you have a whole set of public noticing. The key difference is that in the type 3 process, currently the one that we use, there's a public hearing and it's conducted by the hearings official who makes the decision. And then the appeal goes to the planning commission. In the type 2 process, it would go to the planning director, and then the appeal would go to the hearings official instead. So this is really, Goal 15 sets out that they want everybody, for the most part, to have a type 3 process, which means you use the goals compatibility standards and you hold a public hearing. But there was an alternative option. And the alternative option was to do an administrative review. That would be our type 2 process with the planning director doing that. But you also had to adopt a design plan, and the design plan had to be adopted at the state level. And one thing that we heard in public testimony was that people wanted to maintain their level of engagement and opportunity to provide comment. That was a pretty consistent message we were hearing in the testimony, was that they wanted to maintain that type 3 process and having a public hearing. Also, other clear and objective processes like our planned unit development, conditional use permits, those all go through the type 3 process. So it'd be consistent in that way if we kept it in the type 3 process. And then lastly, we ran into some pretty complex issues as it comes to adopting that design plan at the state level. And it's unclear to us, or it's not necessarily unclear, but the process that was laid out for us, we're not sure that we agree with or is the right case. So we think for this case, we talked about it in the EIS, that the best option for moving forward at this time is to keep the Willamette Greenway process entirely as a type 3, to remove the idea of making it a type 2 process, have the public hearing for all Willamette Greenway permits. And we believe that the meat and potatoes of this process is creating a set of clear and objective standards. And that's really where the reduction of barriers is going to come from, is having those clear and objective criteria. And so I'll offer this chance. Lauren, do you have anything you'd like to add to that conversation at this point?
No, I think that was a great synopsis, Jeff. I'm available if planning commissioners have questions about any of that. Looks like Commissioner Ramey does.
Are we allowed to ask? I mean, what's the strategy here, Chair?
I'm going to suggest, Commissioner Ramey can go ahead. And I think as we go through this and talk about these changes between Jeff and Gabe, maybe they can just call on commissioners as we go through, just to kind of expedite the discussion.
Right.
So, Commissioner Ramey.
So a hearings official is involved, well, and anybody, when there isn't a clear and objective standard, where it really is something, decision needs to be made. So at this, if we're leaving it type 3, which I don't object to, but I'm just wondering what exactly is the hearings official's task? Because they're looking to see if the clear and objective standards have been met. And so testimony would either be, yes, they were met, or no, they weren't met. Is that right?
Commissioner Ramey, I think you raise a great point. We do have other clear and objective track applications that use the type 3 process. So as Jeff pointed out, the planned unit development applications, conditional use permit applications, even though they have clear and objective standards, they do go through a type 3 process. So they go to a hearings official. And theoretically, yes, the clear and objective standard would be a sort of a checkbox. You meet it or you don't. However, what we have experienced, and you as Planning Commission, I think, have experienced in appeals of clear and objective track applications that come to you, is that sometimes there are questions about the evidence that an applicant has provided to show that they meet the approval criteria. Certainly neighbors and other folks have brought up issues with whether, for example, the geotechnical report hits all the bases or something like that. So the standards themselves are clear and objective, but there still may be questions about the substantial evidence that underlies those standards and upon which a decision maker would have to base their application.
Right. Okay. Well, honestly, the river is such a precious commodity. Well, that's probably the right word, is it? Asset to the university, to the city. Whoops. That having a little extra process, I think, reflects its importance to us as a community. I do worry a little bit about leading the public on, in that they can come and state their case to a hearings official, and there could be some confusion about what it is they can actually testify about. So that seems like we just add some frustration to everybody, but I think it's a good move, and I'm okay with it.
One thing I will mention too for the planning commissioners, I don't think Jeff hit this particular point, but both a type 2 process and a type 3 process run on the same timeline. So the decision needs to be made within 120 days, regardless of that process. So the type 3 process isn't a longer process for an applicant. It just, the main difference is that it involves a public hearing, whereas type 2 public comment can be submitted in writing, but there's no opportunity for a hearing, at least at the initial stage. Commissioner Fragala, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. I would like to say that I'm also very supportive of there being a public hearing. I think that was something that we heard reflected in the public comments at the last public hearing. And I agree that this is a very precious resource in our community and needs to be well cared for. However, I am very interested in the comparison chart on page 12 of the packet, and I'm using the PDF number, where it describes the process of similar cities along the Willamette River. And I do notice that both Salem and Springfield have a type 3 and a type 2 situation, so they use both. And I was wondering if you could speak to the distinction there. And also, I do think it might be beneficial to be more similar to our sister city. So I'm just a little bit curious about why they have 2 and 3. And I'm hearing Jeff say that there's and I remember, and I read this, that it's much more difficult to implement the type 2 process that we previously were headed for.
Commissioner Fragla, if I may, I'd like to introduce Colin Mcarthur and say a few words a little bit about the research that was done and what resulted in this chart. Colin and his firm have been providing some of the research, and he is probably most familiar with what this chart does reflect. I noticed the same thing, and I had some similar questions about how they may have locally accomplished something less than a public hearing process, right? In the context of the goal, a public hearing is required unless we go through this, never used process of attempting to adopt a design plan and reduce that process to something less without a public hearing. I am not familiar enough with Salem or some of these other codes to know what the genesis of that was, what the adoption process was that came to be, and then how those type 2 processes came to be. But my understanding is that they are sort of couched in terms of magnitude. Right. And so I think of a comparison here where with our existing Greenway permit procedures, there's a type 3 process, there is a public hearing, and after a decision, applicants can seek through our code as it is today to modify an approval, which is allowed and it is in code as a type 2 process. So I think in terms of the gradations of or the magnitude or intensity, the level of change from what was originally approved is definitely something that we already do locally as a type 2. But I can't say, and I don't have confidence as to whether or not, well, what I will say is that based on our conversations with staff at the state level, that no one has undertaken the design plan adoption process to have that LCD approval of a type 2. And so I can't quite say how that came to be, but Colin may have something else to add here for context. So I want to give him that chance.
Yeah, thanks, Gabe. Thanks, commissioners. I'm Colin Mcarthur, planning consultant with Cameron McCarthy, and have been working with the city on the technical components of this study. That's a very good question from Commissioner Fragla, and it's been a few years since I've done the permitting work in Springfield and in Salem, so I'm going to sort of speak off the top of my head, but I do want to give you a very I'll follow up with a very precise answer for what exactly does Springfield and Salem approve through a type 2. But what Gabe just reiterated or stated is generally correct. And Springfield uses terms like low impact and high impact to evaluate development proposals, and a facility that is low impact, and I'll use, for example, a water dependent use, and that might be a trail or a path along the river, could be reviewed through a type 2 process. They also use that process for the establishment of the setback, which is interesting and something we'll talk about here a little bit later on. Is there, in concept, you can establish a setback on your property without even going to development. Development can happen later, and if it were development that would trigger a conditional or discretionary use type of development, then that would go through the type 3 process. I'm a little less familiar with Salem, and I'll refer just to give you that more detailed information. But yeah, what Gabe said, modifications, establishing the setback, or very low impact facilities are what we've seen permitted through the type 2 process.
Okay. I would wonder about low impact and high impact as clear and objective criteria, honestly. But I would like to see something that includes a public hearing and is also, I think we've heard in other instances, like clear systems, easy to navigate. And so I don't want to create a difficult system for individuals or developers to navigate. So I just was curious about that. I am supportive of going the type 3 process route because I'm supportive of having the public hearing involved.
Commissioner Beeson.
I just want to say I'm also definitely supportive of going to the type 3 and having the public hearing for all the reasons that have been said. I don't think we're talking, it's a very specific area of the city that's important and fragile and a resource for the entire community. So I think it's important. I guess I share the concern about the potential confusion if you're having a public hearing and people come and there's clear and objective standards that they may not be a lot for them to weigh in on. But I think maybe we can flesh that out a little bit more as we go along. I'm kind of assuming that we're going to go ahead and reopen the record and we're going to have a public hearing. I know we still need to have that discussion and make that decision, but and when we get out there and have a chance for the commission to have heard from the community and then deliberate on it, maybe we can kind of iron out the details of that and see if we can resolve any confusion on that.
Excellent. Well, with that, that's actually a great transition. I'm going to be handing it over to Colin to actually start discussing some of the relationship between Goal 5 and Goal 15 requirements and the setbacks and the like. So take it away, Colin.
Thanks, Jeff. You can move to the next slide, and I'll begin by talking about the proposed setback. So through our work in the design plan and attempts to establish consistency between Goal 15 and what we already have in place for Goal 5 regulations, one of the key elements of the proposal is the establishment of a setback. This is talked about. It is in Goal 15. We do have areas of our city that already have established setbacks, and I'll talk more about those through this presentation. And then the concept of a setback is in alignment with protection measures used by Goal 5. And in fact, the Willamette River has a 100-foot setback that is designed to protect those water resources. In this case, we're using the setback to protect a different set of qualities for the river, and is designed to keep structures separated from the river and again protect the greenway itself. But we do see that a setback is used as an implementation measure across both goals. So we proposed establishing a setback from top of bank. Both state law and Eugene code have clear definitions for top of bank, and top of bank is also used as one of the measurements to apply the setback in goal 5, water resources. So it's already built-in definition. And then we had access to LiDAR data from City of Eugene that has a relatively high degree of accuracy, and we're able to estimate the top of bank on the ground, and then also to field verify it using a number of test sites. So the design plan and the code amendments, which the design plan supports the code amendments, propose a 100-foot setback, 100-foot Willamette Greenway setback from top of bank. And again, this is intended to be an established consistency with water resources and goal 5. So this is one of our case studies that shows where the setback would be applied along the river. And I think, Jeff, you're actually in the Willamette Greenway Mapper app right now, driving around. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, good. So this is accessed. It's on city's code amendment webpage. Anybody can access, but you're able to zoom in and see property and how the proposed setback and top of bank lines may lie upon that. We may fall upon that. Excuse me. So we do have a few case studies that I'll get to. Before I do that, I did want to respond to some very good questions from Planning Commission at the public hearing about where, particularly what lands would be affected by the proposed setback, and particularly what residential lands, and then what developable residential lands would be affected by the setback. So moving back out, this is one of the supplemental maps we prepared for Planning Commission. I think this has made it to you or will soon as part of your informational materials that you receive. This is what we're calling other lands within the Willamette Greenway boundary, and it starts with data from the Eugene 2012-2032 buildable lands inventory, looking at committed lands and what we're calling other lands. And so I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but I'll reiterate, committed lands are lands that are devoted to parks, schools, government offices, cemeteries, right-of-ways, other features that have no development or redevelopment potential. And when you extract those, what you're left with is other lands, and those are the lands that do have development and redevelopment potential, and I will focus on those for the remainder of this. But this shows you that within Eugene's portion of the Willamette Greenway, there are almost 1,800 acres of land, and of that, 1,569 acres are committed lands. So not available for development, redevelopment, unless they are rezoned. And of that, the remainder is 213 acres. So 12% of our greenway would be considered developable other lands using this analysis. Drilling further down, commissioners asked us last time about what's the zoning of these other lands, and we found that there are 453 lots within the other lands, and so that's about a little less than half an acre per lot. That is skewed by some very large lots, but we did find that the majority of these lots are zoned R1 or R2. I think 339 of these lots are R1, R2, And then the next highest proportions are C2 and special area zone designation. So that again, over the majority of lots that developable lots that would be affected by the setback are zoned residential. Next slide. And then within that subset of other lands developable, we broke that further down into undeveloped, vacant, partially vacant, protected, and developed. And that's what this map shows. These are definitions that are consistent with or used in the BLI. I'm sorry, I don't have these acreages for each of these categories in my presentation tonight, but I can get you that information. But in terms of how the setback is applied and what the setback affects, we're primarily interested in the undeveloped vacant and the partially vacant, because those are the ones that would be subject to a greenway permitting process and the setback if they were developed. And then moving on to the last map, which really focuses on where the setback is applied and the land, and of these other lands, how much of that would be affected by the setback. And I think, Jeff, you can move to the next map. And so this again is isolating the other lands and looking at where the application of the setback would apply to these properties. And we found that 67 lots the setback would be applied, or lands within 67 lots. And if we only look at the area that is protected by the setback between the setback and the top of bank on those 67 lots, that amounts to a total of 15 acres. Now that seems very small relative to the large expanse of the Greenway, but remember that we started with 1,800 acres and drilled down to 213, and now we're down to the edge that will be protected by the setback. Pause for any questions, and then I can go. Looks like none. Oh, Commissioner Isaacson and Commissioner Beeson.
Thanks. So mine's kind of a long-winded one, so bear with me. I'm sorry. The general thesis that I come to this with, let me take down my hand for a second, sorry, is that, during the discussion on HB 2001 was about, we have 9,000 more people estimated to be coming in here, or 9,000 more units of housing rather, coming in here in the next 10 years. So we got to find places to put them. We have to build density, and I'm obviously fully supportive of that. The question then becomes, what do we do once they're here, right? What's the quality of life? And I think on any list of the reasons why people would move here, the Greenway and the river is on that list. So preserving both the, we'll call it culture or environment of the Greenway is really important to me. I live within a block of it. I can see it from my house right now. So it's obviously very important. And there's a big difference between the east side of the river and the west side of the river. If you jog along one, it is night and day. And so the folks in the River Road area, myself included, are concerned that the ethos of it might be changed. And so, for example, when we're talking about the setback, a 100-foot setback ends within the West Bank Park and has no real impact on housing. But there are some parts of it where a 100-foot setback doesn't would not be impacted by a large development. And so if you were to develop that area, the tree line or the natural buffer line would not be obscured. And so again, when you're running along or using that path, you're going to feel as though you're running next to someone's house or backyard, if they're having a barbecue or whatever. And it takes away from the experience that is currently there, and again pushes it more toward I'll call it east side versus west side. So given that the affected area is relatively small, and we were, in my view, would want to try to limit development in these areas as much as possible in very surgical areas. A 200-foot setback is, to me, the right way to go. So I was wondering what your thoughts are, Colin, on that, with everything I just said in mind.
Yeah, thank you for those comments, Commissioner Isaacson. Looking at precedent citywide, we just haven't seen the establishment of a 200-foot setback. The setbacks that have been established previously, and we'll show you some examples of those, range anywhere from 35 feet to 75 feet. And then if we try to draw consistency or establish consistency with goal 5 and water resources, which is arguably more of an intensive environmental protection measure than the broad aesthetic. I'm not trying to minimize the might of the Greenway, but Goal 5 is much more focused on natural resources. We find that is set at 100 feet. So primary intent of
you lost your voice.
How's that? Okay, that's sorry. I'm not sure where I cut out, but the intent of 100-foot setback, recommended 100-foot setback, was to establish and maintain consistency with water resources and Goal 5 protections. A broader setback is something we can certainly consider, and we expected to have that discussion at this level. I just don't find a lot of existing policy, code, things that we've applied or done before that supports a greater setback. But again, I'd welcome any input from Gabe or and Gabe and Lauren.
Yeah, I would. Oh, go ahead, Commissioner Isaacson. Yeah, go ahead.
If I could clarify, I'm less concerned with precedent because, again, if you look at the east side, right, the existing precedent allowed for that to happen, and if the precedent is what we're basing the argument on, and that is what has allowed the east side to occur, then the precedent is what needs to be targeted in terms of whether or not it's legitimate for the west side, right? So for me, I would need an argument for why the precedent it has to be something beyond that, right? And again, we're talking about a very small section that's being impacted here. So I'm not saying I'm proposing a motion here by any means, but when we go into the deliberations, if we could have a separate slide that shows how many lots we're talking about at 200 feet or 150 feet versus 100 feet, that would give, I think, the rest of the Planning Commission a better feel for what the impact of this would be, so that if 10 years from now we hit our 9,000 units of development and someone does come in and build larger apartment complexes along the Greenway, that those folks who live there don't have a better ownership, whether it be a view or a tactile experience of the Greenway than anybody else.
Mm-hmm. Chair Beeson, Commissioner Isaacson, if I may, I'll follow up with a little bit more background and context and some of the thought process that went into where we're at today with the draft code. And I know Colin will share some of these slides that reflect the graphics, but generally speaking, we are in the intent proceeding forward from the beginning was to start with existing policy direction, particularly around Goal 5. And, in terms of the scope of the project, it was a particular concern, this relationship between Goal 5 and 15 and, what resources that each of those independent goals attempt to protect, we started with the perspective of wanting to avoid expansion of the scope in terms of amending Goal 5. And so I do think that there's room in this conversation for talking about whether 100 feet is the right policy choice, so to speak, the right measurement of setback. I also see that, at least from my own perspective, that the development on the east side of the river, that pattern of development, its proximity to the river, is very much a function of 40 plus years or more since the Willackenzie area plan on the east and north sides of the river, all the way from basically I-5 to the Beltline. It's 35 feet according to an adopted policy in that refinement plan. And so the development along there appears to reflect that. And you see that pattern, right? Whether or not that was the right policy choice back then, this is an opportunity to relook at that. Now, I want to ask a question back to you and say, and I believe it to be true, that your focus is really on the west side here, where that development potential exists, where the most perhaps utility or protection has yet to benefit the river, right? The development hasn't occurred yet. And so there might be an opportunity if we were to expand the setback. And I know that the River Road community organization is interested in that back. That is something that we can explore. We can present materials that show what the effect of that is. But I also do have some concern with respect to, and I think what would be revealed is the potential of creating a large number of legal nonconforming uses, right? That line may in fact end up cutting through quite a bit of existing development. That's not necessarily a no-no, but it's a significant policy choice, and it might affect the interests of those property owners. And so again, another reason why I think it's important enough to the community that we get this right and we look at it comprehensively, that that we can explore that and bring that back as a concept. But at this point, at least with the additional work that we've done, we haven't moved off of the original recommendation for 100 feet here. And so I don't know if that helps for context, but just expressing a little bit of my thought process around that. And I do see that, the utility of it would be greater in these areas of undeveloped lands that remain, and where the additional protection could have an effect that is specific to that area. And so there is benefit to exploring that, and we can do that. Colin, if turn back to you and show some of these examples that might help illustrate that physical relationship.
We've got Commissioner Ramey's got a question.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So as long as we're doing this kind of research, the Greenway really is about more than two things, but essentially it's about the view from the river. So when you're in the river looking back, top of bank plus 100 feet takes care of that, I think. Could be wrong. And then the other experience is traveling parallel to the river. So when you're going alongside the river, and that's the concern that Commissioner Isaacson is raising. And that experience is really dictated by where the path is. So the path can be close to the top of bank, which means it's like 80 feet from the setback, or it can be right on the setback, as we can see these two different examples here in this things on our screen. So as long as we're doing our research, I would like to be sure we understand where the path is in relationship to the setback, because it's really about the path that we're talking about. And so that's an important extra little detail.
Commissioner Fragla.
Yeah, and just for my own clarity, because I heard Gabe bring up the non-legal non-conforming uses, do takings laws apply to this at all, Lauren?
So good question, Commissioner Fragla, and I wanted to dig into the legal non-conforming use issue a little bit as well, because I think I just want to kind of remind everyone that the setback only applies if someone is putting new development on their property, intensifying the uses that exist on their property, redeveloping their property. So we're really only looking at the setback in the context of someone who needs a Willamette Greenway permit to do the thing that they want to do on their property. And the setback only applies to the clear and objective track, which is only available to folks who want to build housing. So you're going to, first of all, it needs to be somebody who wants to build housing. They have to choose to use the clear and objective track. And at that point, one piece of that clear and objective track is this, at this point, proposed 100-foot setback from the top of bank, within which basically no structures can be built. There are a few small exceptions for that. But so, if you have a pre-existing use on a piece of property that's within the setback, but you're not proposing to do anything with your property that would require a greenway permit, the setback doesn't really affect you. Similarly, with your takings question, we're not necessarily saying that nothing within the setback can be utilized or developed, and even if that's true to some extent, because there's generally no structures are allowed within the setback, someone who wanted to develop their property can always still choose to utilize the existing subjective Willamette Greenway track, which does not have a setback. And so they would then go through and work through the approval criteria in the subjective track, which allows for more flexibility in terms of where development can exist on a lot and in relation to the river. And on top of all of that, we already have the Goal 5 Water Resources Conservation Area overlay, which includes its own 100-foot setback for protection of the river as a resource. So in some ways, this is a big change, but in other ways, it aligns very well with existing code requirements for properties located near and along the Willamette River. Does that answer your question, Commissioner Friedel?
Yeah, it doesn't sound like takings is a concern.
If I may, that is one of the things that I'd want to explore a little bit further. Lauren, thank you for that clarification in terms of when the setback actually kicks in and the relatively narrow scope and the focus of this on housing proposals. But one of the things that we would need to do is a mapping exercise to look at, hey, in the case of certain properties, where does that 200, does it swallow up the entire property such that through this track there is no option for housing? Well, we would want to understand that, but I don't think that it would not remove their ability to go through the subjective process. And so they still have an option, and we still, I think, have a defensible approach to some challenge for takings in that case.
Okay, I think we could go on to the next one.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Beeson. Thank you, Commissioner Fragala and Commissioner Ramey for good questions. Commissioner Ramey, I took note of the request for some mapping that looks at the relationship of the setback with the bike path, and we can work on that and bring that back to you. Going a little further into how the setback is applied, wanted to show you some examples of areas in the city that would reflect the application of the setback. A couple of these areas are in River Road, and two of these areas are areas with prior established setbacks. So this is a first area along River Road. You can see the Greenway boundary shaded in green transparent color. Top of bank is in green. Proposed setback line is 100-foot offset from that, and then we do see the bike path in this screenshot diagram, and that bike path is actually between the setback and the top of bank, and then there's a segment of the bike path that does extend to a street connection. So this is an area where the setback 100-foot setback would apply and would protect this swath of river. I've got another one further up on the Greenway, and part of the intent of this is to talk about the relationship between Goal 5 and Goal 15 and those protection overlays. This is an area that reflects a change in the Greenway boundary, and this stems from when the Greenway boundary was originally drafted and included all public lands adjacent to the Greenway. So Greenway boundary extends to the west. To the south, there's existing residential development that is excluded from the Greenway. And then to the north, you can see there is some residential development that has previously occurred within the Greenway boundary. And this is a more unique area of the river with some side channels and wide expanse of protection. And this is an area where the top of bank line extends further out along the river. And in fact, we found the top of bank to be very close to actually where the Greenway boundary was originally drafted back in the back 40 years ago. But we cannot, through this mechanism, we can't apply the setback outside the Greenway boundary. So that's why you see a little movement in the setback. But to the north, setback, actually go back one, thanks Jeff. To the north, setback does extend up through some prior developed residential, and we have worked to align and sync Goal 5 with Goal 15 in terms of prior developed areas and protections. So those are areas that would be considered prior developed in the Greenway Code amendments and already in water resources. And if they were constructed before, I forget the specific date, November 2005, and are on a foundation, gravel pad, or otherwise meet the definition of prior developed, then they could be redeveloped. Areas that do not meet that definition would of course be subject to protection under water resources and under the proposed Greenway Code amendments. Gabe, did you have something you were going to interject?
Well, yeah, I think I want to follow up on this and actually touch on, I think it was Commissioner Ramey's question following the hearing, and specific to whether or not be possible to look. This is a particular area that illustrates where we chose initially to accept the entire lots out by virtue of them being developed with residential uses already. Part of the thinking very early in the process was that, in the context of middle housing, they may or may not have interest or potential, but that the opportunity would potentially be there, and so we sought to draft code that would, and the map was shown originally to carve out these lots so that the setback would have followed the property line closest to the river rather than at 100 feet from top of bank. And so this is one of those key areas where I think it relates back to one of the commissioner's questions. It relates back to kind of a fundamental piece where we are very conscious and careful in our approach to integrating Goal 5 and not creating inconsistencies such that we would have to expand the scope to go through and add a Goal 5 plan amendment. And so recognizing the marginal utility of that and the question that Commissioner Ramey asked, we looked closer and realized that there was, sort of an inadvertent inconsistency with goal 5 that we'd created. And so what we've done is to revise the map as it's shown here. And I think it gets back to Commissioner Fraggla's question of, well, what would that look like in the case where the setback, it runs through those houses and encompasses most of the lots. But for the sake of consistency and recognizing that the implications aren't as great as we had thought, we are recommending that we go back or at least like additional input from the commission on whether or not this specific area is one that we would revise the code and the map to show the line as it's represented here. So this is reflective of one of the key changes. So I just wanted to put a finer point on that.
Yeah, thank you for elaborating on that background, Gabe. That was helpful. I know we're getting close on time. Let me show a couple of other areas, and then Commissioner Beeson, I'll come back to your question. This is the downtown Riverfront site. This is one of the areas that has an prior established setback, and it's a customized setback. It's designed to encompass the new downtown Riverfront Park that opened, not to encroach upon the steam plant. It skirts around the steam plant to allow for redevelopment, and then to protect more areas to the south. So you can see that customized or prior adopted setback on this site. And then on the other side, top of bank extends, encompasses significant amount of Alton Baker Park. So that area is protected within the boundaries of Top of Bank. And then you see the boundary for the Willamette area plan, which I'll show on the next slide. Again, you see difference, west side, east side. West side proposing the establishment of 100-foot setback, and the east side we've got a prior established setback from Willamette area plan that is set at 35 feet. This is the Valley River Center site. The Greenway boundary itself extends further into the site, but again, this is development pattern from 40 years ago or 40 years ago or more recent, and much of this area would meet that definition under water resources of prior developed, being paved or on a foundation, a roadway. Again, if there were areas within the 35-foot setback from Top of Bank that were not developed, natural areas, those would be protected under the Greenway. And then we still do have the protection afforded by the water resources setback, which is 100 feet from Top of Bank. So if there were areas that are not prior developed within that 100 feet, they would be protected under Goal 5. That line is not illustrated on this map, but I just wanted to further reinforce Gabe's point about alignment between Goal 5 and Goal 15, and making sure that the Goal 5 protections remain unchanged.
Sure, that's a question.
Yeah, yeah.
I think I'm going to hold it. I am also concerned about time a bit. Let me try to ask it briefly, and I'd be looking for a pretty short answer. This refers specifically to housing, which I'm going back to what Gabe was saying just a minute ago, which kind of triggered my question. When we're talking about the setback, I mean, we're going to have conversation about the setback and how far it should be, and it's proposed right now at 100 feet. And there are a certain number of pieces of residential property that are impacted by it. I'm going to want to look at that map in a little more detail. I'm trying to get kind of a grip on how many pieces of property we're talking about. But just so the way I'm understanding this, that change that you've made, instead of excluding an entire piece of property that had development on it from the setback, you're now talking about the proposal would be we'd be excluding the footprint if I'm hearing it right, which I'm taking to be kind of the house that's on it, which if you're talking about residential property. So I'm assuming in the occasion that there is a piece of property, the setback goes through all or most of the property, or the most of the property is inside the setback or some portion. And so that footprint comes into play. What I'm assuming is if all of this went through and was approved and we made this change, that property owner, if they wished under the middle housing ordinance to add to their house, or they want to add additional units, they would not be able to do that. That's kind of what we're saying is if you have that kind of property that we're defining that way, that the only thing remaining in the piece of property is the footprint, which you're excluding. The rest of the property would be inside the setback and you couldn't develop. Am I getting that correctly?
Chair Beeson, I'll try to respond to that with a little more detail. I think you're on the right track. And so again, back to Commissioner Ramey's initial question from the hearing, and also looking closer at the water resource overlay language, we realized that was somewhat of a miss, right? And so we would like to get the input on this change to bring that in. You're right, it would be the footprint of, and forgive me if I missed some of the phrasing here, but paraphrasing code is probably bad on the fly, but generally speaking, yes, it would follow the footprint of the driveway, some concrete or paved areas, the footprint of the foundation, and yeah, so it would limit their ability to redevelop to that footprint where it extends within the setback, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So they get the benefit. So they could convert, for example, they could like do an internal conversion, or they could redevelop. So it's not an impossibility. So I don't want to go that far, right? They could also choose the type 3 process and seek some subjective approval for the ability to develop closer. But at the same time, I want to emphasize this is a relatively small subset of lots, and they're fully developed with nice homes and the like. Like, what is the marginal advantage to or disadvantage to those properties? We think in looking at this policy question and the consistency with Goal 5, that the better approach is to be protective, be more protective in the context of Goal 15, and to make sure that we're not inadvertently amending Goal 5. So,
well, I just wanted to clarify that, and I'm in agreement with it. I'm interested in what the public has to say as we go through and hear more about this, and then we can, I think, explore it more in deliberations. Thanks.
Thanks, Commissioner Beeson, and thanks, Gabe, for that added explanation. I'll switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk more about the code changes and some topics that we're bringing back to Planning Commission for consideration based on further work we've been doing in response to your questions and further evolution of the draft code. So I'll start by talking about standards in general. So these are the clear and objective standards that would be adopted as part of the code amendments. And these standards are generally intended to address the massive structures along the Greenway, distance of those structures from the river. They're intended to affect landscape and open space requirements through added setbacks and landscape standards that are applied to those setbacks, and they're intended to promote public access, public and private access to the Greenway, and then to allow the city or give the city some tools to require public access where public access doesn't generally exist. So this is an example site plan that shows a housing development in the Greenway. You can see the setback line as measured from top of bank. Thank you, Jeff. That's the red line. Structure needs to be located outside of the setback substandard. There's a sub note A, that would limit the maximum length of the building facade within 40 feet of the setback to 80 feet. We are requiring a 10-foot minimum depth landscape area along the setback, and that landscaped area would be landscaped in accordance with L2 standards, but must include native plant materials. We'll talk a little bit more about that. There is a standard D that prohibits fences and walls within the setback in order to pick up something Commissioner Ramey said earlier, Greenways, about when views to the river, to promote views to the river. And then there's a standard that limits fences within this landscaped area and requires it to be 50% transparent. And then the final standard depicted here is a pedestrian a pedestrian standard that requires a connection from the main building entrance to the edge of the Willamette Greenway. I'll highlight two things we're bringing back for further consideration. The first is the location of parking and vehicle use areas on the site, and this standard did draw some public comment and some concern about potential conflicting standards with other special area zone standards and code standards in general that require the building to front the street or have a relationship to the street. And although the standard was originally intended as in the draft code to put parking behind the building, parking away from the greenway, vehicle use areas away from the greenway, we realized that there was a conflict and that we were not able to resolve that conflict, and don't want to create a conflict with other standards that require a relationship between the building and the street. So that is a standard that is proposed for deletion from the draft code, in order to better align with those special area zone standards. So there's that. And then next slide, we were asked to think about some questions about whether L2 was the right landscape standard to apply to the setback. And that's that 10-foot setback strip that's 10-foot landscape area that is next to the setback. Excuse me, I'm conflating landscape area and setback, but this is the 10-foot landscape area that was within the site next to the building. We proposed L2. This shows a comparison of L1 through L4. There's not a lot of difference in terms of trees and ground cover, but there are some differences in shrub installation and requirements. And L2 requires 30 to 42 inch shrubs, and that they form a continuous screen. So a relatively low landscape screen in the landscape area. And then L2, if we were to move up to that, would require 6-foot shrubs, and that those be continuous. And that, in our opinion, runs somewhat contrary to preserving views to the river and visibility from the streets to the bike path and the river. So we would prefer to keep the standard as L2 and maintain a little more transparency, both looking from the greenway and looking from the street towards the greenway. Next, we've got a couple other slides that I showed in the last meeting, and I'm sorry about that. That was an orientation issue with the last slide that I had attempted to fix, but fixed unsuccessfully, it appears. But this is an axon that points out the native landscape buffer I was just talking about, that would be 10 feet, required to be landscaped to an L2 standard, L2 standard with native plants. That's an important part of the standard, that it does have native plant material. And this shows a parking and vehicle use area that is between the building and the street. And we had, the prior code did require that as a standard, but again, we've deleted that standard due to conflicts with other code standards that promote street frontage and buildings on the street. So with that, I think, we've got, I did want to touch on one other standard, public access, and then Gabe's going to talk a little bit about tree preservation. So we do have some standards in the draft code that are about public and pedestrian access, and working backwards to how we got here. We did some technical analysis and design plan looking at public access and river access. This is a map that shows all of the existing river access points to the Greenway along the river, and we found that there are 28 river access points, and those points provide a variety of opportunities, including boat and paddlecraft launch points, fishing, wading, wildlife viewing, and scenic viewpoints. And so all of these are, again, our public river access points. And then just for public access, which is the next slide, again, the technical analysis and the design plan found 58 public access points, and this is where public right-of-way intersects with a multi-use path connection along the river. And then that's accessing the Greenway. And then to get across the Greenway from one side of the river to the other, we've got 6 bridges, 6 crossings of the river. So the draft code does include 2 standards that are focused on public access. There is one standard that requires a pedestrian connection from main building entrances to the edge of the development site near the river, and that would apply to any housing development with 5 or more units in the Greenway. And then there's another broader public access standard that is designed to allow the city to acquire public access where public access doesn't exist. And that standard requires a public access connection through or along the site where a development, housing development, is located more than 500 feet from one of these access points. So if your development occurs within these points and that point is not within 500 feet of another point, then the city could request a public access connection through this process. And I could go into more detailed background on why 500 feet, but we determined that to be a good measurement and a good way to apply the standard. Next, I think, Gabe, you wanted to queue up some tree preservation, so I'll let you go to that.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Colin. I appreciate that. Really good overview of a combination of new information and what the draft code has in terms of its tools. I think perhaps one of the biggest new topics would be that of tree preservation, and it's one that is certainly of a high degree of community interest and has garnered attention at council's level as well. And so we thought it was prudent at this point, given the pause in the process, to bring this topic to the commission and get a sense of whether or not and how we might begin to integrate some of those tree preservation standards if the commission feels that that's an appropriate shift in the draft code content at this point. And so we provided a little bit of background information in your agenda materials. One of those really important pieces that I want to encourage you to review or refresh, I should say. I think most of the commissioners have been heavily involved in that process to some degree or another. And this is what I'm speaking of as the clear and objective ordinance. And I use that phrase as sort of a, a loose term, but that is a process that was passed last year. It's currently under appeal. And so it's not in effect yet, but I provided that ordinance as some background to reflect on, and as a starting point, I think from staff's perspective, this was good work. It was very thoughtfully done and very much reflecting an incorporation of a lot of community input. Whereas under the clear and objective requirements and our needed housing track applications previous to this ordinance, didn't have as precise or clear or effective rules. We see it as a significant movement forward in the interest of tree preservation. Generally speaking, this overall, we're also very concerned and I think want to be thoughtful as we move forward about this balance, right? In terms of maybe the perspective of reducing barriers to housing, which was a significant push recently with middle housing code amendments, but then also recognizing that Goal 15 affords local jurisdictions like ours the ability to provide additional regulations that help to protect the resource. And so we think this is, and I'll also share that, as a practitioner of Greenway permits and reviewing that from the regulatory side, and in response to Mr. Belcher's comments, I would say that this is perhaps one of the biggest missing pieces. And so upon a little bit more reflection, we realized, okay, so how does this fit? Well, among the clear and objective changes, we recognize that this inherently subjective set of standards for Greenway permits was complex and really was outside the scope of that much broader process. So we set that aside. And I think this would be the opportunity, and we would be remiss for not bringing the topic to you all. And so without going into a great level of detail, we wanted to get a sense from the commission of whether or not we should incorporate these provisions. And so the concept with these is that we have a new set of standards and we would be relying on those from, 9.6885. And Jeff, if you don't mind, maybe we could pull up that language. And without getting too far into the weeds, what this does do is establish some clear and objective definitions. It requires an applicant to sort of collectively at a cumulative level measure the DBH of trees on a particular development site, and then it sets out some exceptions. So for example, lots that are less than 20,000 square feet are accepted out. Anyway, this reflects some policy choices that were made very recently. And this is not tried and true in terms of practice, right? But this is, we think, a great place to start. And if you want to proceed a little bit farther, Jeff, one of the key factors here is, and I thought was interesting and worth noting as you kind of dig into this yourselves, but the policy choice there that's reflected around percentage of mitigation and preservation is one that I want to come back to the commission and discuss. We know that there's interest in treating the Greenway differently than all other areas within the city. And so when you look at this and you see outside South Hills area, we sort of across the board treated that the same. Minimum preservation of 40%, but you can mitigate that entirely, right? So 40% of the diameter of the trunks of the trees collectively could be mitigated. So that means you could remove them and replace them. And so this set of standards requires that tree removal and preservation plan. It sets some standards that we may want to tweak. I think we will need to make some adjustments to it. both in terms of the level of preservation or mitigation, and also just the details of integrating this to the Greenway standards. But we believe that this would be an important topic for more conversation. And given, well, in the interest of time, I think I'll stop there and ask if there is any thought or input from the commission, just at a big picture concept level. And the other piece to this that I want to touch on is that if we do go this route and add tree preservation standards, it would generally be for the portion of the development site outside of the setback, right? Because the presumption and the way the code works is that the setback area, all those native species are protected through Go5 provisions, the water resource overlay, all that. So we'd be looking at the balance of the property where now, currently under the type 3 provisions, those tree preservation standards don't apply. And by creating this new track, we'll maintain consistency with that of PUDs, CUPs, all the other work that was done in that clear and objective ordinance process. And so we felt that the time was right to bring that. And we have ideas for how to incorporate it. Want to get some feedback before we lurch ahead and start drafting code. So any thoughts, comments, questions from commissioners about that?
Commissioner Bailey.
I'm not sure I fully understood it, Gabe, but I am all in favor of tree preservation and certainly think you should consider it and bring something to us for consideration. But then toward the end, you mentioned it would be outside the setback area. And if I heard that correctly, it makes me wonder, outside the setback area, are you imposing or should we impose any other kind of prohibitions like impervious materials or pesticides, or, you open a whole other arena of possible items to address once you're going outside that setback area?
That's a great question. And I think it opens that door to, well, what else, right? And I appreciate that. And so first and foremost, we would come back with more information if there's interest and if there is direction to bring something back. We would work from that existing set of code and bring you something that we think works and fits and integrates well. I was alluding to a suggestion from staff, at least an initial thought process, because effectively everything within the setback's protected, right? The water resource overlay precludes the removal of native riparian vegetation, except for a few sparing instances where they can declare it's demonstrated as hazardous or whatnot. But outside the area, we don't, if there are existing groves of trees that happen to contribute to the scenic value of the property, and our code criteria don't address them now, we feel like that's a missed opportunity. Now, I would caution you also about the scope of potential changes. So you've brought up some other topics. I know they've been brought up in some of the testimony about pervious paving or pollution. But in terms of the scope, I think it's important to kind of ground ourselves back in to what is the purpose, right? We need a clear and objective set of standards that are related to housing. And these tools that we're using are very intentional, as at least from our professional perspective, as bona fide goal 15 requirements that are necessary to meet the intent of the goal, right? And so how far and wide we go, we're cautious about that, right? And we also, I think just a general theme is that we are looking for efficiencies where we can rely on existing code or the good work of the clear and objective ordinance, things of that nature. So again, on tree preservation, if you go there, I think there needs to be a clear distinction about invasive versus native. Okay. Okay, well, that's another point I'll touch on briefly, and then I see several other questions coming. So one of the things that we will provide for the record and for you all to peruse is the actual native plants list, which is already adopted and it's been determined. And, you know, we had natural resource experts on staff that helped develop that and determine kind of the schedule of appropriate plants and where those should occur. It actually at the end has a list of non-native invasive plant species that are a no-no. So I encourage you to take a look at that and just trust that, yes, we do very carefully review those kind of planting plans as part of a development project.
Commissioner Ramey.
Thank you, Chair Beeson. And thank you, Gabe, for that extra detail. I have two things. One, not expressly on topic, and pardon me if I keep asking this question. The water resource overlay, is it also 100 feet from top of bank?
It is. And I think it's, again, just an important policy choice that it was made back in 2005. And it is as part of our adopted Goal 5 plan. That is where we landed. Yeah. Okay. And that's a reflection of the Willamette being our most important resource. Yeah.
So I would say that something to think about are those little diagrams that Colin had. If we add the water resource setback on there, people begin to see how these things are starting to line up. Well, you're already in the water resource. So, so anyway, now my actual question. Thank you for letting me sneak that one in there. Tree preservation, yes. I would like to see a matrix or a comparison of how this would affect development. I don't know if it's by zoning code, maybe, but the same kind of thing where, okay, if you're in R1 and then you're in Greenway, it triggers it. If you're in R1, you're not in the Greenway, you don't do tree preservation. Just so we can see how it's changing some of those, because I think some of those zones were excluded from tree preservation before, but I don't remember. So I just want to see if we're being more stringent or the same as what we had before.
Great. Yeah, that's definitely something that we'll bring back as part of a code concept for tree preservation. I do recognize there's some exceptions in there that we may want to change for the Greenway in terms of applicability. So fair game.
Commissioner Fragala.
I'll just say at this time that I am interested in exploring the tree preservation standards as part of this code development of this clear and objective standards. I think we put a lot of really good work and effort into that. It's a good place to start. But I do think because it's the Greenway, we may need to there'll be modifications and we may need to go a little bit farther.
Okay, let's see, I agree. I think we should look at the tree preservation standards. I think we may want to go a little bit further. I want to go back very briefly, and I don't want to, again, trigger a lot of detail because I think we need to kind of think through it. But when we were talking about parking, on the first draft of this, I particularly liked the fact that we weren't going to allow parking in between the buildings and the river. And it strikes me all the way through this, what we're doing is developing clear and objective standards specific to this area. And we're going to offer people who want to build a house or to develop a residential piece of property the opportunity to use the clear and objective path. And we're talking about, we have a number of things that don't apply anywhere else in the city. And I've read and I continue to hear that, well, we backed off on the parking because of we were nervous about it not being consistent with special area zones. I find myself at times wanting to think of this as a special area zone. I understand there's kind of some parallels. I kind of get that. But to me, it's like kind of not a special area zone at all. It's a river with some pretty particular attributes that we really want to take care of, which is why we're building in the clear and objective standards. So I don't know that we don't really have time to get into it. I'm kind of thinking as you to one extent or another, if you guys redraft the code and we put it back out, have another public hearing, and we have deliberations, I guess I'd want to at least have the opportunity for us to re-examine that whole question. I mean, I understand if there's some kind of statutory requirement or something on the parking that I'm missing, that's one thing. But anyway, just a comment.
I just want to echo that. I had those same thoughts. So I'm going to want to look at it also.
Me too.
I appreciate that interest, and I knew it would garner some, and I think partly this is also about the relationship of the building to the river. So just to impart that additional thought, and we will bring it back for more discussion. We can override potential conflicts with other standards in this area and treating it uniquely. That's why we proposed to begin with, and that we, in the context of it being a bona fide Goal 15 related thing, a standard that we want to implement. But it was particularly convincing to me when I realized the interest, and particularly from River Road constituents out there that pointed out the fact that the effect would be, one, to eliminate that inconsistency with having parking between the building and the street, and this interest in having the pedestrian environment be more welcoming by having it framed with door fronts and in that proximity. But what it does do is have the effect, or the byproduct of it is, if that parking area is between the building and the river, the building is farther from the river, right? Just inherently, you think about it in terms of design, one of the potential effects of that would be to add additional setback that's not necessarily required, but in terms of design might make sense. And so at this point, I wonder, with the time that we have, if we couldn't just maybe tick off the list and see if I've got a good sense of where we're at. But I'm sensing we may not need to do straw polls, but I heard what I think is a majority of support to move to the type 3 procedures. I didn't hear a lot of feedback or objection to the notion of incorporating prior developed area provisions from the water resource overlay, which we would intend to do with the revised code. Tree preservation, we will bring back for more discussion, and a concept that's reflective of our conversation tonight. But with respect to parking and next steps, right? What we'd like to do is take some of this feedback tonight and these concepts, work on them, and before we presume too much about next steps, we'll want the commission to act on this question of whether to reopen the record and hold a hearing. But on the parking question, should we actually delete that requirement now, or leave it as it is and call it out as something for more discussion? Part of what I'm trying to do is assess what is actionable now for staff to take back, work on draft code. And the idea would be that we have enough clarity that we're not running afoul of your interest or input, but that we have enough of a defined product to then share with the public and explain and work through, knowing that it's not the final product, but it's good enough for a second public hearing. So,
Commissioner Isaacson.
Yeah, so much of this is kind of dovetails one into the other, right? So, for example, on the shrubs between L2 and L3, if we had a further setback of 150 feet or 200 feet, I personally would be fine with the L2, right? But if we're not going to go with it, when we have right up against the property line, then I'm not uncomfortable with L2. I want it to be L3 because people on the bike path shouldn't have to feel like they're cutting through someone's backyard to use it, right? So it really needs to be kind of a trade-off on what the ultimate wisdom of the Planning Commission in consultation with staff is on the impact here. So that's the lens that I'm looking through this from. So I don't know if that helps in kind of crystallizing my own viewpoints on this.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and there is a bit of a conundrum there in terms of looping back, right? It's like well, if we don't know what the change is, if, what would we do with, in terms of the setback, if we were to increase it, and that might change opinions about L2 or L3. But I also want to try to draw out a little bit of, maybe a little more discussion if we have time. If others have thoughts about L2 and 3, we proposed L2 with the interest of kind of having filtered views to and from the river, not kind of a one-sided perspective, right? The same thing with the transparency requirement for the fence to be 50% transparent. So parking areas and L2 or L3 seem to me to be a couple of things that like to see if we should revise the code now or wait.
Commissioner Fraggle, why don't you go ahead of me? Go ahead.
I have a process question, and then I think I can answer your question, Gabe. So were we planning to meet again to discuss this topic prior to a public hearing? Because I'm feeling like we just barely touched the surface tonight, and it would feel a little rushed to me if we did not meet again to have another conversation prior to a public hearing. I feel like there seems to be more need for input on some of these topics. And I know staff is looking for direction on beginning to develop the code, but what are the plans for our next steps?
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. And I'll be honest, coming into this meeting, I was intending to play it a little bit by ear. But understanding the complexity and the importance of the content, particularly around tree preservation being new to fold in, I fully support and expect that we will need another meeting in advance of a hearing. And that might actually set up the timing well so that we can revisit these topics, perhaps after the record is reopened, right? So we may be hearing feedback about our conversation tonight and these concepts that may affect or influence that outcome, but we can come back to you with draft code and dig in a little bit deeper, right? And focus in on some of the wording and the structure and things. So yes, I think that's important and necessary.
Okay, so then if that is the process we will be following, my response to you would be around parking. Like my initial reaction was, why would we want to put the parking there, like between the building and right next to the river? So I guess I kind of need to be able to have a conversation about both options. And before I'm going to get to an understanding with the vegetation, L1, L2, L3, I think I understand not wanting to block the view as well. L2 tends to make sense, but that could shift depending on some of the other variables. And definitely the tree preservation, I think, is going to be a more extensive conversation. So those are the areas and the distance of the setback, as I clearly heard Commissioner Isaacson ask for information on what it would look like at 200, what would it look like at 150, and we have the 100. So I feel like I personally need more time and more information on some of these key areas, but it seems like there are some areas that are a little more settled.
I want to agree with Commissioner Fraggle, and I think it would be good if we have another meeting in advance of the public hearing. And a number of these things, clearly, we could talk through some more. Certainly the parking and the trees and the things that are being mentioned here. I think before we run out of time, it would be good to, one of the things we were looking for tonight is whether or not was the idea of reopening the record and then also scheduling a public hearing. I think we could probably, I'm going to wing it here a little bit. I think if there's agreement.
There we go.
I lost the screen for a second. Yeah, if we had agreement on the part of the commission from the commission to have another meeting, I think at that point in time we could then go out of that and schedule the public hearing.
Sure.
I'm sorry, what?
I said, I'm prepared to make a motion whenever you are prepared to have someone make a motion, but I also noticed that Commissioner Bailing had her hand up as well.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I was just, I was making a couple of comments. But let me, I think before we're done, I would just like to resolve whether or not we're going to have another meeting and also whether we would go ahead on the motion. So let me go to Commissioner Bailing.
I just wanted to ditto the request for more information on the tree preservation and the parking. I am very much in favor of not having parking between, immediately adjacent to the river. And I need a point of clarification. I may be naive about this, Gabe, but all the way through the documents I read and the design plan, there's reference to Willamette Greenway and there's reference to Willamette River Greenway. And I want to know if there's a difference or if you just haven't gone all the way through the document and made it all consistently Willamette River Greenway.
It's the latter, and I apologize, but it's a work in progress. Yes, we definitely need to make it consistent, and I appreciate your attention to that detail.
It's the editor in me, sorry.
Okay, I can see Lauren's got her hand up also.
Thanks, Commissioner Beeson. I just wanted to maybe provide a little context for the motion, the proposed motion that's in your packet on page 8, I believe, and that Jeff had put up on the screen a moment ago. Simply directs staff to schedule a second public hearing, but doesn't identify the date at which the public hearing will be scheduled. So Planning Commission can make that motion tonight. That would not preclude another work session type meeting between now and the public hearing. It would just give staff direction that at some point in the future, Planning Commission does want a second public hearing on this. So
okay, thank you. So I guess what I'm would be looking for, and maybe Commissioner Fragola can do this, would be the motion that was in the packet. And also, I guess we probably would need a motion to have a second meeting and just be sure we all agree.
So I can make that motion, Chair. So I move to reopen the Planning Commission record to accept written testimony on the proposed Willamette Greenway Code Amendment, City File Number CA 22-1, and to direct staff to schedule a second Planning Commission public hearing on the proposed amendments.
I'll second that.
Okay, it's moved and seconded as stated by Commissioner Fragola. I won't go through all just as she stated it. And I guess all in favor, I would ask to please raise your hand. Anyone opposed? Okay, so it passes. I'm thinking it might be good too if we have a motion to have I don't know, if we can all just agree, maybe a quick show of hands, just a straw poll on having a second meeting. Maybe that would suffice.
That would work just fine.
Is everybody okay with that? It looks like we're all okay with that. So I guess you guys will schedule that, and then out of that, we'll determine how we go forward with public hearing.
Commissioner Beeson, it also would be beneficial because more of the planning commissioners who weren't able to be here tonight might be able to be at that meeting as well. So it'll be a broader input.
That's good. That's right. Okay.
Jeff,
is there anything else on that, or because I think we've reached the end of our meeting?
I'll just really quickly conclude by saying that now that the record's open, probably sometime tomorrow, you'll all be receiving access to a Dropbox with some additional information, such as the maps that Colin shared this evening and the ordinance and other things that we haven't included in the record yet.
Yeah. And along those same lines, I'll just add that as we embark back out into the public realm with this topic, we will be notifying folks of this action tonight and asking for that input, or at least opening the door to it. We will share that in a timely way as we go along. And also, really, I think the timing of this meeting is going to depend on a little bit of figuring on how much work that's going to take and the like. But we will bring it back as soon as it's reasonably practical to do so.
Good. Thank you very much. It was a good discussion. I'm going to say we've got about a minute left if Alyssa has some things, and if I can ask for the minute. It's okay with the commission. Maybe we'll take a couple of extra minutes. Do you have some things for us?
Yes, I do. I have just a couple of things. I can burn through them pretty quickly. So I think many of you know, but last night, council reappointed Commissioner Tiffany Edwards to a second term. And they also appointed Jason Lear to fill Kristen Taylor's term that she had termed out. I had listened to his interview and I was impressed by, he's currently on the city's Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and he will start July 1st. I think if you were watching last night, you noticed that they were given 3-year terms. Those should have been 4-year terms according to the city's code. So the city manager's office is working to take care of that so that they can get their full 4-year terms. And then there's just a couple housing projects I wanted to update you on. I guess they're more legislative projects related to housing. So just again, Terry sent out the email, but middle housing passed unanimously at council, and you all played such a big part in that I just wanted to thank you again publicly at a meeting just for your dedication, your thoughtfulness. I was really impressed with your work on middle housing. So thank you for that. Last week, Heather and team presented the growth monitoring report to council, and they accepted that unanimously. So that was also just a huge milestone for the organization, and just really excellent work. And you also had a hand in that in many ways. Some of you are on the ETAC, some of you know, it also came to you here at Planning Commission. A code amendment that has been around and kind of up and down the courts for a while is accessory dwelling units, and that is finally finalized. The city council's most recent ordinance was appealed to the Land Use Board of Appeals. LUBA said they agreed with council's approval, and that was not further appealed. So that has been finalized and is fantastic. The cool thing about that one is that the way the ordinance was written is that it went into effect when council adopted it. So people didn't have to wait to build their ADUs until that got approved. And it's my understanding that we have seen a fair number of permits since that ordinance was approved by council, maybe more in like the last 4 or 5 months than we'd seen in the last several years. So that's outstanding. And then finally, clear and objective, which you all talked a little bit about tonight, another code amendment that you were deeply involved in, very thoughtful, very deliberate, getting approved by council, appealed to the Land Use Board of Appeals. LUBA issued a remand on a pretty narrow issue about, had something to do with a measurement, and that the city didn't define well enough how that measurement would be actually measured. That was appealed to the Court of Appeals, who affirmed LUBA's decision. So next steps on that are staff will be working through what it will take to address the remand. It will probably not come back to Planning Commission. It will probably go just through council and go through a public hearing there, since it is a fairly narrow issue. I'll let you know if that changes. I did send you, moving on. I sent you an email about the climate friendly and equitable communities rules that the state adopted. Once those are, they temporarily adopted. Once those are permanently adopted, we'll be coming back to you with a work session and walking you through the variety of actions will be required to take as a result of those rules. And then finally, I sent you an email this morning. You might not have all seen it, about the land acknowledgement statement. So we got some clarity And I was actually really grateful for this clarity because it was a little bit unclear to me if the expectation was, or if it was okay that the Planning Commission kind of put their own stamp on what the city had been using. And the clarity that we received from the city committee that's working on this is that they want everyone, all the boards and commissions, to use the same statement that the council is using. So we can start, you can start using that at the next meeting. Just, at the beginning of the meeting, decide how you want to do that, if you want to rotate it. If you have any questions about that, I'm happy to see if I can answer them, or I can talk to the staff working on that. The newest commissioners will get a training after our very newest commissioner starts July 1. So we'll be scheduling that after we actually get a hold of him. And then finally, we do have a meeting scheduled on the 28th. If that is too soon for the Greenway to come back, we will be canceling that meeting. We'll let you know as soon as possible. We don't have another item at this point for that meeting. And I think that wraps up everything I had. Happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Any questions for Alyssa? Okay, good. I appreciate everybody's time. We went over a bit, but we're got some good work done and good discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much.